Hello, my dear friends, and welcome back to Mild History. Before we step into tonight's story, I want to pause and ask you something simple. Where are you listening from this evening? Perhaps you are lying in bed in a quiet apartment in the city, the hum of traffic far below your window. Perhaps you are in the countryside, the air cooler and stiller, maybe with crickets outside your door. Or perhaps you are studying or resting on a couch, using this calm voice as a gentle companion at the end of a long day. Wherever you are, it's a joy to have you here tonight. Now close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you back to another time, back to Victorian Britain, a world both familiar and strange. A world of cobblestone streets lit by gas lamps, of horse-drawn carriages rolling slowly through fog, of chimney smoke curling against a gray sky. This is the backdrop for one of life's most celebrated milestones, the wedding. Victorian society was fascinated by weddings. Newspapers wrote about them in great detail, especially if the couple was wealthy or titled. Shop windows displayed lace, veils, and pearl accessories. The white wedding gown, popularized by Queen Victoria herself in 1840, became a powerful symbol of purity, modesty, and idealized femininity. For many people, the wedding day was described as the happiest day of a woman's life, the culmination of her upbringing, her family's hopes, and society's expectations. But beneath the flowers, the bells, and the photographs, there was another reality, one rarely spoken of, one whispered in private, one hidden behind bedroom doors. The romantic image of the Victorian wedding night was a myth carefully constructed by society, while the lived experience for many women was shaped not by tenderness, but by fear, ignorance, and the crushing weight of duty. Let us linger on the myth for a moment, for it is important to understand just how carefully it was crafted. Imagine a grand Victorian home decorated for a wedding. Guests fill the parlor, the women dressed in fine silks, the men in stiff collars and polished boots. Musicians play softly in the corner. The bride appears, clad in white satin trimmed with lace, a veil falling over her face. To the crowd, she seems angelic, pure, radiant. Every detail, from her gown to her flowers, speaks of innocence, virtue, and the beginning of a new life. The ceremony itself is solemn and filled with symbolism. The vows are spoken, binding not only two people together, but also two families, two fortunes, two futures. And once the words are said and the signatures made, the bride and groom are presented to the world as husband and wife. Applause follows. Smiles beam. Photographs are taken, though long exposure times mean that faces are often frozen, serious, as if even happiness must be contained. This was the side of the wedding the world saw, the public side, the myth, and it was powerful. It told society that marriage was the foundation of morality, that a bride was pure, her groom noble, and that their union was blessed. But the myth was only half the story. As the guests left and the laughter faded, reality began to creep in. For the young bride, often barely out of girlhood, the end of her wedding day was not a moment of calm anticipation, but a looming fear. The wedding night was spoken of in hushed tones, never fully explained, never openly taught. Women were expected to know nothing, to approach the marriage bed with innocence, and to simply endure whatever came next. Mothers, bound by the same silence, rarely prepared their daughters with more than vague warnings about duty and submission. The myth told her that marriage was bliss. Reality told her nothing at all, and so she stepped into the bridal chamber with a mixture of dread and confusion. Consider also the groom. While men often had more knowledge of the world, more exposure to sexual matters, they too bore the crushing expectations of society. A groom was supposed to claim his bride, to prove his manhood, to consummate the marriage without hesitation or failure. Masculinity itself was judged on this one night. Failure meant shame, whispers, even annulment. For both bride and groom, then, the wedding night was less an intimate union and more a test, an ordeal framed as romance. The room itself became symbolic. Picture a Victorian bridal chamber. Heavy drapes pulled over the windows, shutting out the night. A large wooden bed draped in thick blankets, its carved posts standing like sentinels. Candles flicker on the dressing table, casting long shadows across the walls. Flowers sent by guests are already wilting in their vases, their fragrance mingling with the scent of candle wax. The air is heavy, expectant, and waiting within this room is the cruel truth. That intimacy, which should have been about love, trust, and discovery, was instead bound up in duty, law, and proof. One of the most inhuman practices of the Victorian wedding night was the demand for evidence of consummation. Families sometimes expected to see the bedsheets, to confirm that the bride had been pure and the marriage properly sealed. A bloodstain on linen became, in this cruel logic, a symbol of honor. Without it, suspicion could take root. The bride's reputation could suffer, her family shamed, her husband ridiculed. What should have been private became public, and what should have been tender became a test of endurance. This was the reality hidden beneath the myth. The white dress symbolized purity, but it also symbolized pressure. The vows symbolized love, but they also symbolized ownership. And the wedding night, cloaked in romance and the public imagination, often marked the beginning of a lifetime of duty for the bride, with little consideration for her feelings or desires. As we continue tonight, we will pull back the layers of this myth, examining not just the rituals of proof and the silence of families, but also the weight of purity, the burdens on both bride and groom, and the long shadows such practices cast over Victorian society. But for now, let your mind linger in that quiet room. Imagine the soft glow of the candle, the heavy fabric of the curtains, the stillness of the night broken only by the faint crackle of the wick. Imagine the young bride, her hands clasped nervously, her breath shallow. Imagine the groom, equally burdened by expectation, caught between desire and dread. They are not romantic figures from a painting or a novel. They are human beings, trapped by the weight of their time, living through what history now remembers as one of the most inhuman practices of the Victorian era. Imagine again the day of a Victorian wedding. The morning began not with joy, but with anxious preparation. Servants hurried through hallways, carrying gowns and gloves, arranging flowers in vases, and setting the tables for guests. The bride, often very young, sat still while her hair was arranged and her gown adjusted. She was the centerpiece of the day, yet she had little say in the arrangements around her. Her role was to look beautiful, to embody purity, and to move gracefully through the rituals that others had designed for her. The gown itself was a statement. Queen Victoria had set the fashion by wearing white satin when she married Prince Albert in 1840. Before her, brides of every class often wore colorful dresses, sometimes simply their best Sunday gown. But after Victoria, the white dress became a symbol of purity, innocence, and moral respectability. Newspapers praised it, merchants advertised it, and soon the ideal of the virgin bride in white spread through Britain and beyond. Even families of modest means sometimes bankrupted themselves to provide a gown that would uphold their daughter's reputation. But the dress was more than just fabric. It was a costume, one that carried with it immense pressure. The whiteness suggested untouched innocence, yet it also drew attention to what would happen on the wedding night. The dress was a veil over reality, hiding the fear, silence, and ignorance of the bride beneath a symbol of perfection. Guests gathered in the church, whispering about the beauty of the bride, the wealth of the groom, the arrangement of fortunes. Weddings were not only personal unions, but also public spectacles of family honor and social status. Bells rang, hymns were sung, and the ceremony unfolded with solemnity. In the pews, friends and neighbors leaned forward to catch a glimpse, their curiosity fueled by the knowledge that after this day, the bride and groom would begin the private work of consummation. The photographs taken after the ceremony show us faces stiff and unsmiling. In part this was due to long exposure times required by early cameras, but it was also symbolic of the Victorian approach to marriage. Serious, solemn, heavy with duty. The bride looks fragile in her layers of lace, the groom stern and steady beside her. These images, preserved in family albums, reinforced the myth. They showed marriage as orderly, respectable, and blessed. But what they never showed was what followed, the private ordeal that began once the doors were closed. Let us linger on that moment when the guests departed. The laughter faded, the carriages rattled away, and the couple were left alone. For many young brides, this was the first time they had ever been in such a situation, alone with a man, expected to yield to his touch, with no knowledge of what that meant. Victorian society prided itself on keeping young women innocent, shielding them from knowledge of their own bodies, their desires, or the realities of sex. It was believed that ignorance was virtue, but this ignorance came at a cost. Mothers rarely explained what awaited their daughters. If they said anything at all, it was cloaked in warnings, that a wife must submit, that she must be dutiful, that she must never refuse her husband. Advice manuals echoed the same, instructing women that their purpose was to please their spouse, to endure without complaint, and to accept intimacy as part of their role. Some brides went to their wedding night believing that it would be nothing more than lying beside their husband, holding hands, perhaps a kiss. Others were told to expect pain, but nothing more was said. The silence was crushing. And so, when the bride entered the chamber, she carried with her fear, confusion, and a sense of inevitability. The groom, too, carried burdens. Masculinity was measured by performance. He was expected to know what to do, to take control, to prove himself on this one night. Failure could lead to whispers among relatives, ridicule from friends, and in some cases, legal consequences. A marriage unconsummated could be annulled, leaving the man branded as weak or unmanly. This pressure meant that the wedding night was not only an ordeal for the bride, but also a trial for the groom. The chamber itself seemed to echo these expectations. Beds were often heavy with carved wood, their size and decoration meant to symbolize wealth and stability. Curtains were drawn tight to keep out the night, creating a sense of enclosure. Candles flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment. Sometimes, relatives even lingered in nearby rooms, waiting for proof of what had taken place. Privacy, which should have been the essence of intimacy, was instead overshadowed by the eyes of society. And then came the cruelest of customs, the demand for proof. In some households, it was expected that the sheets would be inspected the next morning, or even that they would be displayed publicly. A stain of blood was taken as evidence of the bride's virginity, proof that she had entered the marriage pure and that the husband had fulfilled his role. Without it, suspicion could spread quickly. Families might whisper that the bride had been impure, or that the husband was incapable. Reputations could crumble overnight. This practice, both invasive and inhuman, turned a private act into a public judgment. It stripped the bride of dignity and reduced her body to evidence. It also ignored the reality that not every woman bled, that not every consummation left visible signs, and that intimacy could not be reduced to a stain on fabric. But logic did not matter. The myth demanded proof, and families often enforced it. For the couple, then, the wedding night was less a tender union than a performance under pressure. They were actors in a drama written by society, their every move scripted by tradition, law, and expectation. As the night unfolded, many women endured pain, fear, and humiliation. Some wrote later of their trauma in private diaries, confessing feelings of dread and sorrow that lasted for years. Others remained silent, bearing the memory alone. The myth told the world that the wedding night was romantic, a culmination of love. The reality, for countless women, was something far darker, and yet the myth persisted. In paintings, poems, and novels, the bride was always radiant, the groom always noble, the marriage bed a place of bliss. This image reassured society that all was well, that morality was upheld, that families remained honorable. It was a mask carefully maintained, hiding the truth beneath. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Victorian world not as we picture it now, with its sepia photographs and dusty museums, but as it truly was, alive, breathing, and full of people who lived under the constant weight of expectations. In this world, few ideals were as carefully guarded, as relentlessly enforced, as heavily mythologized as purity. For a woman, especially a bride, purity was not simply a personal trait. It was a family's honor, a community's judgment, a society's demand pressed upon her shoulders. From childhood, girls were taught that their worth rested not in their minds, not in their talents, but in their virtue. Virtue, in the Victorian sense, meant chastity. A fallen woman, as society so cruelly termed her, could lose everything: respect, marriage prospects, even her place in her family. Purity was seen not as a private choice, but as a public possession, belonging as much to parents and husbands as to the woman herself. This obsession shaped every aspect of life. Clothing emphasized modesty, with high collars, long sleeves, and layers upon layers of fabric designed to shield the body from view. Literature spoke of innocent maidens as ideals, while women who strayed from chastity were cast as cautionary tales. Mothers warned daughters to guard their reputations with silence and reserve. Even casual conversation between unmarried men and women was closely monitored, lest a glance or a word suggest impropriety. By the time a young woman reached her wedding day, the idea of purity had been so ingrained that it was no longer her own to carry. It was the invisible thread connecting her family's name, her father's pride, her mother's reputation, and her future husband's honor. She was, in many ways, presented less as herself and more as a symbol, her body the canvas upon which society painted its ideals. This weight bore down most cruelly on the wedding night, for it was not enough for a bride to appear pure. She had to prove it. The demand for proof, evidence of virginity in the form of blood-stained sheets, turned a personal, intimate moment into a public trial. In some households, the linen was discreetly inspected the next morning. In others, it was paraded, shown to relatives as if it were a badge of honor. Imagine the humiliation of knowing that one's most private experience would be reduced to fabric, to a stain scrutinized by others. And yet, this ritual persisted. Families justified it as tradition, as necessary, as a safeguard of reputation. But in truth, it was an act of cruelty disguised as morality. It ignored the realities of women's bodies, that not all virgins bled, that intimacy did not always follow a script, that pain and blood were not the true markers of love or purity. Still, the belief endured, creating fear in brides who dreaded not only the act itself but also its aftermath. The silence surrounding sexuality made this fear worse. Women were not taught what to expect. They were not told that consummation could vary, that it might not result in visible signs, that their worth did not truly depend on blood on linen. Instead, they were left to imagine the worst, and to enter marriage carrying both ignorance and terror. The wedding night, then, became a stage where the weight of purity bore down with relentless force. For men, too, purity was part of the narrative, though in a different way. Male chastity was less rigidly enforced, and men often had more freedom before marriage. Yet once married, they were expected to uphold the myth as well, to prove that their bride had been untouched, to deliver the evidence that society demanded. A husband who failed to provide proof might be ridiculed, his wife's reputation tarnished, and his own masculinity questioned. In this way, the burden of purity ensnared both sexes, twisting intimacy into obligation. Purity was also bound to religion. The church reinforced the idea that women must remain virtuous until marriage, and that their submission thereafter was divinely ordained. Sermons warned of the dangers of lust and the sanctity of chastity. Religious texts were interpreted in ways that bolstered the idea that a woman's body was not her own, but her husband's once the vows were spoken. This spiritual weight added yet another layer of pressure to the already crushing societal expectations. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Victorian obsession with purity was the silence it created between generations. Mothers, who themselves had endured the same fears and rituals, rarely broke the cycle by warning their daughters. They believed that modesty meant silence, that to explain too much would be to tarnish innocence. And so young women entered marriage knowing nothing, while their mothers carried memories they dared not speak aloud. This silence was inherited, passed down like a family heirloom, binding one generation to the next in ignorance and fear. We must also consider the role of class in all this. For wealthier families, purity was tied not only to morality, but also to inheritance. The legitimacy of children determined the passing down of fortunes and titles. A wife who was thought to be impure could jeopardize an entire lineage. In working-class families, the stakes were different, but no less severe. A daughter's reputation might determine whether she married respectably, whether she lifted her family's status or dragged it down. In both cases, the woman's body became the battleground upon which social and economic futures were fought. And so the weight of purity hung heavy over every bride, from the grandest lady in a London mansion to the simplest girl in a country cottage. On the night when she should have been embraced as a partner, cherished as a person, she was instead judged as a vessel of honor, her humanity eclipsed by a stain on linen. Consider for a moment how strange, how invasive, how profoundly inhuman it is to take a private act between two people and demand public evidence of it. And yet in Victorian Britain, this practice was not only accepted but sometimes celebrated. The so-called stained sheet ritual was one of the clearest examples of purity turned into spectacle. Historical accounts tell us that in certain households, especially among the upper classes where reputation and inheritance mattered most, servants or family members would quietly wait the morning after the wedding. The bed linens, once removed, were carefully examined. A red mark, however small, was treated as a triumph. In some cases, the sheets were displayed, folded or hung where relatives could see, as proof that the bride had entered marriage untainted. Imagine, if you will, the humiliation of knowing that your body's most private moment had been reduced to a mark of blood on cloth, and that the cloth itself would be paraded as though it were a banner of honor. Not every family demanded such a display, but the knowledge that it could be expected was enough to fill brides with dread. Even in homes where the ritual was not practiced, whispers about it traveled quickly. The expectation hung in the air, unspoken yet oppressive, making the bridal chamber feel less like a sanctuary and more like a courtroom where the verdict of purity would be rendered by the presence or absence of blood. And here lies another cruelty of the practice. Biology does not conform neatly to social myth. Not every virgin bled upon first intercourse. Some women had already lost their hymen through physical activity, or their anatomy simply did not align with the assumptions of the time. Others experienced no visible blood at all. To equate purity with this fragile, misunderstood marker was to invite false judgments, unjust accusations, and devastating consequences. A bride might leave her chamber the morning after in fear, knowing that no matter her innocence, her reputation might already be stained, not by sin, but by silence on the sheets. Religious teachings reinforced this burden. Sermons warned young women to guard their virtue at all costs. Clergy praised chastity as the jewel of a maiden's character, the very essence of her value. Even medical texts of the time, written by male physicians steeped in moral assumptions, treated virginity as a physical property to be verified, rather than as an intimate aspect of a person's life. The voice of science, twisted by prejudice, joined the voices of religion and custom in building the prison of purity. The cruel irony was that women were expected to embody this virtue without understanding it. Sexual education was almost non-existent. A girl might be told in vague terms that she must be good, that she must wait, that she must save herself, but she was rarely told what these words meant in practice. To speak openly of sexual matters was considered scandalous, indecent, even dangerous. Mothers, themselves raised in silence, often passed down the same silence to their daughters. In this way, ignorance was mistaken for innocence, and fear was mistaken for virtue. The result was a cycle of confusion and trauma. On her wedding night, the bride carried not only her own fear, but also the silent fears of generations before her. She stepped into marriage as if stepping into a shadowed room with no candle to guide her, no words to prepare her, no reassurance to soften what was to come. The weight of purity pressed on her chest as surely as the heavy bodice of her wedding gown, tightening with every breath. This silence was not confined to the private chamber. It extended into the very structure of society. In wealthier families, purity was linked directly to inheritance. If a bride was suspected of being impure, or if her children were doubted in legitimacy, the line of succession could be questioned. Titles, estates, and fortunes might hang in the balance. A woman's body, therefore, became not only her own, but also the vessel through which wealth and power were secured. Her purity was treated as currency, her body as collateral in the transactions of family alliances. In working-class families, the weight was just as heavy, though for different reasons. A daughter's reputation could mean the difference between a respectable marriage and a lifetime of struggle. A rumor about impropriety could close doors, turn neighbors against her, or condemn her to hardship. Thus, purity was guarded fiercely, not only by the woman herself, but by her entire household. Brothers might act as protectors, mothers as gatekeepers, fathers as stern overseers. Everyone, it seemed, had a stake in her virtue, except the woman herself. Imagine again the morning after a wedding. The bride awakens, her body sore, her mind clouded with fear. The chamber is quiet, but beyond the door lies the world, waiting for evidence. She rises, her steps unsteady, and sees the sheets pulled back, revealing nothing. No stain, no mark, a silence more dangerous than words. Panic wells in her chest. She wonders if she has already failed, if her worth has already been questioned, if her family will whisper behind closed doors. The truth is that she has done nothing wrong, but society has given her no space to believe it. Even when proof was provided, the ritual left scars. For what intimacy could thrive under the gaze of relatives, the weight of inspection, the knowledge that tenderness was secondary to evidence? The first night of marriage, which might have been a beginning of trust, was instead transformed into a trial, a performance judged by onlookers. It is easy, from our modern vantage point, to see the cruelty in these practices. Yet for Victorians, the obsession with purity seemed natural, unquestionable, even necessary. It was the foundation upon which the family rested, the guarantee of morality, the safeguard of society. But beneath that foundation lay the suffering of countless women, silenced, shamed, and reduced to symbols in a drama they did not write. And so, the weight of purity lingered over every Victorian wedding like a shadow. It was not simply a personal matter of love or choice. It was a burden that pressed down from all sides, society, religion, family law, until a woman's most private self became a public concern. The wedding night was supposed to be the beginning of companionship, the tender opening of a new chapter. Yet for many brides, it was overshadowed by a single narrow expectation, that purity must be proven, not felt, displayed, not lived. This obsession transformed intimacy into evidence, trust into trial, and love into performance. It left countless women walking into marriage not with joy, but with trembling uncertainty. Their bodies were not their own. Their silence was demanded. Their worth was measured by rituals they could not control. And still the myth endured. To the outside world, a wedding was the pinnacle of romance, a shining symbol of purity rewarded. To those who lived it, the reality could be far more complicated and far more painful. The truth lay hidden beneath layers of lace and silence, carried quietly in the hearts of women who could not speak, passed down through generations as fear unspoken but deeply felt. As we turn now to the next part of our journey, let us step into the mind of the bride herself. Not the idealized angel painted by society, but the young woman who entered her chamber with no words of guidance, no candle of knowledge, only the weight of purity pressing heavily upon her. It is here, in her silence, that we begin to understand the true human cost of the Victorian wedding night. Imagine again the young Victorian bride. She has lived her life under careful supervision, watched by her parents, guided by governesses, shaped by sermons, books, and the quiet expectations of society. From the outside, her world looks orderly and serene. Lace curtains, polished silver, the soft rustle of skirts in candlelit drawing rooms. But within her heart, on the eve of her marriage, there is a heaviness. A silence that has followed her from girlhood to this very night. For in truth, she does not know what awaits her. She has been taught that she must be pure, that she must remain virtuous, that her body is to be guarded like a precious jewel. But she has never been told what marriage means in practice. Her mother, perhaps, offered only vague words about duty, about patience, about doing what is expected. No explanation, no preparation, no compassion. To speak of such things openly was considered shameful, and so ignorance became her only inheritance. And so, as she stands at the threshold of her wedding night, she carries with her not only fear of the unknown, but also the knowledge that she must not show that fear. To appear anxious, to hesitate, to falter, these could all be read as signs of impurity or disobedience. She must smile, even as her heart trembles. She must appear calm, even as she feels herself caught in a tide she cannot resist. The chamber is quiet. Heavy curtains blot out the gaslight from the street. The air smells of candle wax and flowers beginning to wilt. The bed looms large, its carved posts and thick drapery giving it the presence of a stage. She feels small before it, as though stepping into a performance for which she has not rehearsed a single line. Her gown, still layered and heavy, presses against her skin. The corset has left red marks along her waist and ribs. She longs to breathe freely, but even her breath feels borrowed, controlled by the fabric and by the moment. Beside her stands her husband. He too feels the weight of expectation, though in a different form. He is expected to take, to claim, to lead. And while he may approach the night with more knowledge than she, he is not free from fear. If he fails, if he cannot perform, his masculinity itself will be questioned. Society has given him no choice but to prove himself in this chamber. But for the bride, it is not proof of action that is demanded. It is proof of submission, proof of virtue, proof of silence. The fear she feels is not only of the act itself, though that fear is strong. It is also the fear of what will follow. She knows of the whispers about stained sheets, of the inspections by servants or family members, of the scrutiny that will fall upon her body whether she wishes it or not. She dreads not only the night, but the morning after. Will she bleed? Will there be evidence? Will her silence be enough to shield her from suspicion? These questions churn within her, and no one will answer them. Fear seeps into every detail. Even the act of undressing becomes charged with dread. She has been taught modesty so fiercely that to remove her clothing feels like stripping away her very identity. Each button, each lace undone, feels like a step toward a precipice. Her hands tremble as she loosens her gloves. Her heart beats loudly in her ears. She glances at her husband, who watches, expectant, certain of what is supposed to happen next. For him, this is a rite. For her, it feels like a test, one she has not chosen to take. The silence between them deepens the fear. Words could soothe, could reassure, could bridge the gap. But words are scarce on a Victorian wedding night. A bride is not expected to speak, except to obey. And so the silence presses upon her, thick as the heavy curtains, heavy as the carved wooden bed, heavy as the weight of purity itself. Some women, in later years, would write in diaries of their terror. They described the first night of marriage as a horror, a violation, an experience that left them shaken for weeks, months, even years. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying the memory like a hidden scar. The culture of silence meant that brides who suffered could not share their fears even with their closest friends. To admit dread was to admit weakness, or worse, to risk being seen as impure. And so the silence continued, binding woman after woman in isolation. And yet, amid the fear, there were moments of small resistance. A bride might delay by claiming exhaustion, by feigning illness, by stretching out the rituals of undressing until the candles burned low. Some husbands, sensing the fear, might pause, might wait, might soften the demands. But these moments were exceptions, fragile and fleeting. The larger truth remained. That fear was woven into the very fabric of the Victorian wedding night. The fear was not only physical but emotional. The bride feared not only pain, but also the loss of herself. For in marriage, her identity shifted. She became, in the eyes of the law, her husband's possession. Her body, her labor, even her children would no longer be solely her own. The wedding night, then, symbolized not only the beginning of intimacy, but also the beginning of ownership. And so her fear was layered. Fear of the act, fear of the judgment, fear of the loss of self. Imagine lying in that bed, the candlelight flickering, the heavy silence pressing down. Imagine the sound of your own heartbeat loud in your chest, the trembling of your hands, the tightening of your breath. Imagine knowing that outside the door, perhaps only a few steps away, the world waits for evidence of what has happened within. And imagine that you have no one to tell you it is all right, no one to tell you that your worth is not measured by blood or silence. This is the fear of the Victorian bride, a fear born not of love, but of ignorance, silence, and a society that made her body a battleground. The fear of the Victorian bride was not a fleeting moment, not simply a shiver that passed in the candlelight. It was deeper, more enduring, because it was rooted in a lifetime of silence. From childhood, young girls were taught modesty above all else. To speak of the body was indecent. To ask questions was improper. Even the simplest curiosity was met with disapproval. A girl who dared to inquire too much about marriage or intimacy was scolded into silence. "You will understand when you are older," she might be told. Or worse, "It is not for you to ask." And so, questions were buried, left unanswered, left to fester into fear. Mothers, themselves bound by the same silence, rarely broke this cycle. Even when they wished to prepare their daughters, they struggled against a culture that equated knowledge with corruption. To tell a girl too much was to risk spoiling her innocence. To remain silent was to preserve her virtue, or so they believed. And thus, generation after generation, women walked into marriage blind, carrying only the warnings of duty and submission. One Victorian advice manual, written for brides, described intimacy not as love, but as obligation. It told women that their role was to endure, to be patient, to never refuse their husbands. Another text went further, suggesting that a virtuous woman would feel no pleasure, that purity meant passivity, that desire itself was improper. These words, printed in neat lines, bound in cloth covers, were handed to young brides as instruction. What could be more frightening than stepping into marriage believing that pain was expected, that pleasure was shameful, that silence was virtue? For many women, this silence turned the wedding night into a moment of profound terror. Diaries and private letters, those rare places where women could confess, revealed glimpses of their fear. One young bride wrote of trembling so violently that she could hardly speak. Another described the night as an ordeal to be suffered. Still others left their words vague, cloaked in modest language, but the weight of dread is clear between the lines. These documents remind us that beneath the lace and ceremony, real women suffered in silence. The physical fear was matched by the emotional. A bride knew that her reputation, her family's honor, even her future security rested on what happened that night. If she failed to bleed, if her husband doubted her virtue, she could be cast into suspicion. If she resisted, she could be branded disobedient, even sinful. If she spoke of her fear, she risked ridicule. She was trapped in every direction. Her silence demanded, her submission required. The fear extended beyond the chamber itself. In many cases, family members were near, listening, waiting, even anticipating proof. Servants moved quietly in the halls, alert to what linens might be carried out in the morning. In some households, the sheets would be displayed to relatives or neighbors, a practice so humiliating that it is difficult to imagine today. Knowing that her body would be judged in such a way added a layer of dread that no tenderness could erase. Even when husbands were gentle, the silence between them remained a barrier. Many brides could not bring themselves to speak of their fears, and many husbands, bound by their own expectations of masculinity, did not ask. The result was a chasm between them, a night that could have been an opening of trust instead becoming a wall of silence and dread. The consequences of this fear often lingered. For some women, the wedding night marked not only a traumatic beginning, but also a shadow that followed them for years. Marital intimacy, instead of being a source of closeness, became a reminder of fear. Some women withdrew emotionally, others endured in silence, and a few, rare and brave, spoke out, risking scandal by admitting their unhappiness. It is important to remember, too, that the law offered no protection. Marital rape was not recognized as a crime. A wife was considered her husband's property, her body legally his to claim. Refusal was not permitted. Resistance was not tolerated. And so the fear carried not only the weight of shame, but also the certainty that the law itself stood against her. When we read of the Victorian bride's fear, we might ask, why did no one speak against it? Why did no one comfort her? The answer lies in the same silence that shaped her life. Society was built upon appearances, upon reputation, upon the myth of purity and duty. To question the wedding night was to question marriage itself, and marriage was the cornerstone of Victorian morality. And so the fear remained, hidden behind lace veils and closed doors, whispered only in diaries and private tears. Let us pause here and imagine, slowly, the stillness of that room once more. The flicker of a single candle, its wax dripping onto the table. The heavy air, scented with flowers already fading. The sound of distant footsteps in the hallway, servants moving quietly, waiting. The bed, vast and imposing, its shadow stretching across the floor. And the bride, sitting silently, her hands clasped tightly, her breath uneven. This is the reality that history's myths so often conceal. Not a night of romance, but a night of fear. History has preserved only fragments of the voices of Victorian brides. Most women left no record of their wedding nights, bound as they were by silence and shame. Yet here and there, in private diaries, in letters never meant for public eyes, we glimpse their fear. One young bride, writing in the 1860s, confessed that her first night of marriage felt like a trial from which there was no escape. She described trembling so violently that her new husband thought she was ill. Another, writing decades later, admitted that she had gone to her wedding bed with no knowledge and no comfort, only dread. She said she prayed for sleep to carry her through, but sleep did not come. These voices, faint but clear, remind us that behind the myth of romance lay lived experiences of confusion and pain. Even in published memoirs, where discretion was carefully maintained, one senses the shadow of fear. Some women cloaked their words in euphemism, describing their first night as difficult, unpleasant, or an ordeal. Others chose silence altogether, skipping over the subject entirely, as if erasure might soften the memory. But silence is often its own testimony. What is not said can sometimes speak louder than words. This fear was not confined to the wealthy, though it may have been recorded more often in their words. In grand houses, with servants and relatives waiting for proof, the pressure was acute. The bride knew that her body would be scrutinized, her sheets inspected, her silence judged. But in working-class homes, the weight was no less heavy. Their purity was tied not to fortunes or titles, but to survival. A young woman's reputation could determine whether she married at all, whether she lifted her family's standing or fell into hardship. For her, too, the wedding night was fraught with fear, not of estates or inheritances, but of whispers in the village, of neighbors' gossip, of the long shadow that a single rumor could cast. The setting may have differed, a richly furnished chamber in a London townhouse, or a simple bed in a country cottage, but the fear was the same. The silence was the same. The ignorance was the same. Across class lines, women entered marriage carrying the same burden. To prove their virtue, to endure their fear, to accept that their bodies no longer belonged to them alone. And what of the marriages that followed? For some, the wedding night was only the beginning of a lifetime of silence. A woman who began her marriage in fear often found that fear hard to shake. Intimacy became a duty, endured but not embraced. Love might grow in other forms, in companionship, in partnership, in the raising of children, but the shadow of that first night remained. For others, the trauma deepened into lasting resentment, a barrier that could never be crossed. Husbands, too, sometimes struggled, unable to bridge the gulf of silence that the culture had created. What should have been the foundation of trust became instead a wall of fear. It is important to see this not as the failure of individuals, but as the failure of a society that valued purity above compassion, silence above honesty, appearances above truth. The bride's fear was not a personal flaw, not a weakness of character. It was the inevitable result of a culture that demanded ignorance, enforced silence, and measured virtue in cruel and inhuman ways. And yet, through all of this, women endured. They carried their fear quietly, they survived their trials, they found ways to live within the constraints imposed upon them. Some even found tenderness in time, building trust slowly, carefully, despite the harsh beginnings. Their resilience should not be overlooked, but neither should the cost. So let us pause here and breathe deeply. Imagine the countless women who once sat on the edge of their wedding beds, hearts racing, hands trembling, eyes cast down. Imagine their silence, their confusion, their prayers whispered into the night. And know that in remembering their fear, we honor their truth. If the Victorian bride carried the burden of purity, silence, and fear, the groom carried a different weight, one rooted in expectation, performance, and the rigid demands of masculinity. His wedding night, too, was shaped not only by personal feelings, but by the heavy hand of society. For him, intimacy was less about tenderness and discovery, and more about proof, power, and public judgment. Imagine the groom, standing in the chamber beside his bride. He has perhaps been celebrated all day, friends and relatives clapping his back, congratulating him on securing a good match. He has been told that he is now a man in the fullest sense, not only because he has married, but because he will soon consummate his union. His masculinity, in the eyes of others, is not complete until this act has been performed. And so, like his bride, he too feels that this night is less private than it ought to be. It is watched, in its own way, by the expectations of family, of community, of tradition. For the groom, knowledge was assumed. Unlike brides, men were not expected to remain ignorant. In fact, they were sometimes even encouraged to seek experience before marriage, though always discreetly. Brothels thrived in Victorian cities, and it was no secret that many men had visited them. Yet even this supposed advantage could be a curse. For such experiences did not necessarily prepare a man for the intimacy of marriage. They often instilled in him expectations of dominance, of performance, of conquest, rather than patience or tenderness. The result was that many grooms approached their wedding night not with understanding, but with pressure and pride, believing they must act quickly, decisively, successfully. Failure was unthinkable. A man who could not consummate his marriage risked ridicule, whispers, even annulment. The word impotence carried a sting sharper than most insults, for it was seen not only as a private difficulty, but as a public humiliation. Medical texts of the time described impotence in cruel, clinical detail, framing it as weakness, as inadequacy, as proof that a man was less than a man. Doctors were sometimes called in to examine cases where a marriage had not been consummated, reducing what should have been private to a matter of legal and medical debate. Imagine the pressure this created. A groom who faltered, who hesitated, who struggled, might find his entire reputation questioned. Relatives could whisper. Neighbors could speculate. In a world where masculinity was bound to strength, control, and virility, to fail on the wedding night was to risk lifelong shame. And so he entered the chamber with fear of his own, not fear of the unknown, like his bride, but fear of failure, fear of ridicule, fear of being unmasked as less than what society demanded. The room became, for him, a stage as much as it was for his wife. The bed, looming in the center, was not only a place of intimacy, but also a place of proof. He was expected to demonstrate his virility, to claim his bride, to provide the evidence that the family awaited. His actions were bound by a script he had not written, but one he was expected to perform without error. And yet, beneath the bravado, many grooms were unprepared for the reality they faced. Their brides were frightened, inexperienced, sometimes resistant. Their silence was not consent, but fear. Their trembling was not passion, but dread. A groom who had been raised to believe in dominance, who had been told that hesitation was weakness, might not know how to respond. Some pressed forward regardless, convinced that it was their right. Others faltered, torn between duty and compassion. In either case, the silence of society left them with no guidance, no understanding, no framework for gentleness. There were men who tried, in their own way, to soften the moment. Some waited, delaying the consummation until trust grew. Others sought tenderness, patience, even kindness. But these men acted against the grain of their society. They had to resist the voices that told them to claim, to conquer, to prove. And not all could resist. Many believed that to wait was weakness, that to hesitate was failure. The burden of masculinity weighed heavily, leaving little room for vulnerability or care. The fear of impotence was matched by the fear of gossip. For just as women dreaded whispers about purity, men dreaded whispers about virility. Families, servants, even acquaintances might speculate about whether the marriage had been consummated. Rumors spread quickly, and reputations could crumble overnight. A man who failed was not only pitted but mocked, diminished, branded as unworthy. The cruelty of gossip was a shadow that lingered over the chamber, pressing upon the groom as surely as the expectation of proof pressed upon his bride. Medical authorities of the time did little to ease this burden. In fact, they often made it worse. Doctors wrote about male sexuality in harsh terms, warning of the dangers of failure, prescribing humiliating examinations, even suggesting treatments that bordered on the absurd. Some cases of annulment were debated in court, with intimate details of a couple's private life laid bare for public judgment. Imagine the shame of having one's most personal struggles dissected in the courtroom, debated in newspapers, whispered about in drawing rooms. The groom's fear was not unfounded. It was built into the very fabric of the society around him. And so, while the bride trembled with ignorance and dread, the groom trembled with pressure and pride. Both entered the chamber as actors in a performance they had not chosen, bound by roles that suffocated love and trust. His burden, though different, was no less heavy. It was the burden of always proving, always performing, never faltering. Let us pause here and picture him more closely. He stands at the edge of the bed, his jacket removed, his hands perhaps trembling though he tries to still them. He looks at his bride, seated on the edge of the mattress, her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He knows she is afraid, though he does not say it aloud. He feels his own fear, though he cannot show it. The silence stretches between them, thick and unyielding. Outside the door, the world waits, not for their happiness, but for their proof. This was the groom's burden, to carry not only his own fear, but the crushing weight of what others demanded of him. To prove his manhood in a single night, to uphold the myth of marriage, to claim his bride not as a partner, but as evidence. It was a burden that stripped intimacy of tenderness, leaving in its place a performance judged not by love, but by law, by family, by society. The weight of expectation placed upon the Victorian groom can be better understood when we look at the cases that made their way into the courts. In Victorian England, if a marriage was not consummated, it could be annulled. This meant that the private failures of the wedding night sometimes became public trials. Judges, doctors, and lawyers pored over the most intimate details of a couple's life, as if love and fear could be reduced to evidence and testimony. In some instances, medical examinations were ordered to prove whether a man was capable of consummation. Imagine the humiliation: a groom, newly married, called before physicians who would scrutinize his body, question his habits, and write reports about his virility. These reports could be read aloud in court, dissected by strangers, whispered about by neighbors. His reputation, his marriage, even his future could hang on the judgment of doctors who spoke not with compassion, but with clinical detachment. The very word impotence carried enormous shame. It was not simply a medical diagnosis. It was a moral failing, a weakness of character, a flaw that stripped a man of his place in society. To be branded impotent was to be diminished, to be seen as incomplete. In a culture that equated masculinity with strength, dominance, and control, such a label could destroy a man's standing. Little wonder, then, that the fear of failure loomed so large on the wedding night. And yet, performance was not the only expectation. A groom was also judged on his ability to control his bride, to assert his authority, to ensure that she submitted as expected. A man who hesitated too much, who showed too much gentleness, risked being seen as weak. The paradox is striking. If he failed to act decisively, he was ridiculed. If he acted too harshly, his wife suffered. Either way, the burden fell heavily on his shoulders, shaping not only his own fear, but also the fear of the woman beside him. For working-class grooms, the burden was no lighter. Though they were less likely to face formal annulment cases, they too lived under the gaze of neighbors, family, and gossip. In small communities, a man's reputation could spread quickly. If whispers began that a marriage was unconsummated, that a husband was weak, that a bride was unclaimed, the gossip could linger for years. Masculinity was a fragile currency, and failure on the wedding night could spend it all at once. Among the wealthy, the stakes were tied to inheritance. An unconsummated marriage meant no heirs, no continuity of family lines. Entire fortunes could be endangered by a groom's failure. In these cases, the burden was immense. The man was not only proving himself to his wife, but to his entire lineage. His body became the vessel of dynastic continuity, his virility the cornerstone of estates and titles. This pressure turned intimacy into duty, affection into obligation. It is easy to see how fear of failure could shape the rest of a marriage. A man who succeeded on his wedding night might feel emboldened, his confidence reinforced. But a man who struggled, even once, might carry that insecurity forward, allowing it to shadow every future encounter. His wife, sensing his fear, might withdraw further into silence. The performance demanded by society left little space for vulnerability, for honesty, for shared humanity. And here lies the cruelty of it. Both bride and groom, though burdened differently, were victims of the same rigid system. She carried the weight of purity, of silence, of being judged by her body. He carried the weight of performance, of virility, of being judged by his success. Both were trapped, both were afraid, both were shaped by a society that turned love into duty and intimacy into trial. Let us pause and imagine once more the chamber on that first night. The groom stands tense, his jaw set, his mind racing with fears he cannot speak aloud. He glances at his bride, sees her trembling hands, her downcast eyes, and feels the silence pressing between them. He knows what is expected. He knows what proof must be given. And yet he feels no joy, only the pressure of a role he cannot escape. Outside, the household waits. Gossip hangs in the air. The myth of marriage demands its evidence. And in that silence, fear binds them both. The marriage bed in the Victorian world was never truly private. For the couple themselves, it might have seemed an intimate space, a chamber lit by candles, a bed draped in linens, the door closed against the household. And yet, in the eyes of the law, the church, and society at large, that bed was a kind of courtroom. What took place there was not simply a matter of love or companionship, but of evidence, legitimacy, and proof. Marriage in Victorian England was both a spiritual bond and a legal contract. At its heart lay the expectation of consummation. Without consummation, a marriage could be challenged, even annulled. This meant that what happened, or did not happen, on the wedding night could have consequences that reached far beyond the chamber. It could determine inheritance, reputation, even the survival of families and estates. In this way, the marriage bed became less a sanctuary and more a stage for judgment. The law treated consummation as essential to the validity of marriage. If a husband or wife sought annulment, the courts required evidence that intimacy had not occurred. Doctors might be summoned, examinations ordered, testimony heard. Private lives were dragged into the open, dissected by strangers. What should have been sacred became spectacle. The sheets, the whispers, the silences of the wedding night, all could become exhibits in a legal case. And it was not only in the courts that judgment loomed. Families, too, claimed the right to scrutinize. In some households, particularly among the wealthy, the bridal sheets were displayed the morning after the wedding, evidence of the bride's purity and the groom's success. Servants might carry them out discreetly, or not so discreetly, to be shown to waiting relatives. The humiliation of this ritual is difficult to overstate. A woman's body, her most private self, was reduced to a stain on cloth, paraded as proof of her worth. The marriage bed, in such cases, became not a place of trust but a site of surveillance. Even when sheets were not displayed, rumors often were. Neighbors speculated, families whispered, servants gossiped. If the bride did not appear the next morning with the expected glow, or if the groom seemed uneasy, tongues wagged. Silence bred suspicion, and suspicion bred stories. In a culture where reputation was everything, the marriage bed was never safe from intrusion. The intrusion extended beyond the first night. If a marriage failed to produce children, questions arose. Was it consummated? Was the husband capable? Was the wife resisting? Doctors were called, midwives consulted, the most intimate details of a couple's life pried open for scrutiny. The marriage bed became a courtroom again, this time judged not only by law but by medicine, by family, by society itself. Consider the cruelty of this system. For the bride, it meant that her body was evidence, her purity a matter of proof, her silence a weapon against her. For the groom, it meant that his virility was on trial, his performance subject to gossip and even legal challenge. Neither entered marriage as free individuals, both entered as defendants in a trial they could never truly win. This transformation of intimacy into evidence reveals much about Victorian values. Marriage was not simply about companionship or affection. It was a social institution, a cornerstone of morality, a means of preserving property and reputation. And like any institution, it was policed. The marriage bed, far from being beyond reach, was one of the most heavily guarded of all spaces. Its walls were thin, not in stone or wood, but in the weight of expectations pressing in from outside. The cruelty was not only in what was seen, but in what was unseen. For how many couples, trembling and afraid, did the fear of judgment overshadow tenderness? How many brides endured pain in silence, knowing that resistance could bring suspicion? How many grooms pressed forward out of duty, fearing the stain of impotence? The marriage bed, in its most cruel form, was not a place of union but a place of trial, where love was judged by blood and worth by proof. Let us pause and picture once more the chamber. The door is closed, but outside, ears are listening. Servants move quietly in the hall, waiting. In the drawing room, family members speak in hushed tones, wondering what evidence the morning will bring. Inside, the bride and groom sit in silence, both carrying the weight of judgment. The candle burns low, its flame flickering, casting shadows that stretch across the bed. They are not alone, though no one else is in the room. The eyes of society are there, unseen but unyielding. The bed is a courtroom, the night a trial, and the verdict will be carried in whispers, in sheets, in silence. The marriage bed, in the Victorian imagination, was rarely free of scrutiny. To us, a bedroom seems like the most private of spaces, a sanctuary of intimacy and rest. But in the 19th century, this privacy was more imagined than real. Doors could be closed, curtains drawn, and candles blown out, but the weight of the world pressed in, and the most intimate act of all was constantly judged, whispered about, or even brought before the courts. A marriage in this era was not merely a bond of affection. It was a contract of immense social, religious, and legal significance. Without consummation, that contract was considered incomplete. In legal terms, a marriage unconsummated was no marriage at all. This single expectation turned the bridal chamber into something resembling a courtroom, where proof was demanded, and failure could carry lifelong consequences. Annulments were the starkest expression of this reality. If a marriage was challenged, evidence of consummation, or the lack thereof, became central. In some cases, courts ordered physical examinations, forcing women to endure invasive scrutiny at the hands of physicians. Husbands, too, were sometimes examined, their private lives laid bare before strangers. What ought to have been sacred, trust between two people, was reduced to testimony, medical notes, and legal argument. Imagine the humiliation of standing before a judge while lawyers debated the condition of one's body, or while doctors testified to one's supposed capabilities or shortcomings. The marriage bed, in such moments, was no longer a place of union, but a site of public dissection. History gives us chilling examples. In one notorious case, a wealthy heiress sought annulment on the grounds that her husband had been incapable of consummation. The court summoned physicians who subjected the man to invasive examinations. Newspapers reported on the case with glee, dissecting his alleged failure in mocking tones. What should have remained private became fodder for gossip across the nation. His reputation never recovered. The bride, meanwhile, though freed legally, was left marked by scandal, forever associated with a marriage that had failed in the most public way possible. This was not a rare occurrence. Across Victorian England, cases like this echoed through society. The higher the status of those involved, the greater the spectacle. But even among ordinary people, the principle was the same. The marriage bed was evidence, and intimacy could be challenged in court. Love and affection were irrelevant. What mattered was proof, and proof meant invasion. Even beyond the courts, the scrutiny continued. Among the wealthy, tradition sometimes demanded that the bridal sheets be displayed the morning after the wedding. A servant might carry them out, or relatives might be invited to inspect them. The presence or absence of blood was taken as evidence of the bride's purity and the couple's consummation. Few rituals were as cruel. A woman's body was reduced to a stain, her worth paraded for others to judge. The sheets themselves became witnesses, cold and unfeeling, yet loaded with meaning. The humiliation did not end there. If no such proof was shown, whispers quickly spread. Families speculated. Servants gossiped. Neighbors leaned in to listen. Was she pure? Was he capable? Did something go wrong? In a culture where appearances mattered as much as truth, silence was dangerous. The absence of evidence became, in itself, suspicious. Couples who wished only for privacy found themselves thrust into a theater of expectation, where failure to provide proof carried heavy social cost. For the working classes, the rituals were different, but the pressures remained. Sheets might not be displayed in such formal fashion, but gossip carried just as much weight. In small communities, word traveled quickly. If a bride did not appear cheerful the next day, or if the groom seemed distracted, neighbors began to speculate. Women in markets whispered, men in taverns joked. Reputations could be damaged overnight. And in a society where honor and character shaped opportunities, a rumor could destroy more than dignity. It could shatter livelihoods. The intrusion extended far beyond the wedding night. If a marriage failed to produce children, questions arose. Was the husband impotent? Was the wife resisting her duties? Families fretted, doctors were consulted, priests offered advice. The couple's intimacy became an open secret, dissected behind closed doors. Some physicians made careers out of curing impotence or treating female frigidity, often with methods that were invasive, ineffective, and cruel. The bed remained a courtroom, the couple defendants, the verdict postponed until a child appeared, or until the union collapsed. Even the church played its part. In confessional booths, priests asked probing questions, ensuring that the union was being properly fulfilled. Religious authorities reinforced the notion that consummation was sacred duty, not personal choice. To deny it was to fail not just the spouse, but God himself. And so silence reigned. Women who suffered said little. Men who faltered masked their shame. The weight of judgment, both divine and social, pressed down heavily on the chamber. The cruelty of this system is perhaps clearest when we consider the experience of the bride. On the very night she was meant to find tenderness and reassurance, she instead faced fear and surveillance. If she resisted, she risked suspicion of impurity. If she submitted, she endured pain that others might later parade as proof. Her body was never truly her own. It was evidence, testimony, exhibit. Even her silence could be turned against her, interpreted as guilt. The groom, too, was not free. His masculinity was measured not in kindness or loyalty, but in his ability to perform. A single night could cement his reputation or ruin it. Failure to consummate marked him as weak, mocked in whispers, pitted or scorned by others. His worth, like hers, was bound to proof. And so many men pressed forward out of fear, ignoring their wives' terror, driven by the knowledge that hesitation might bring humiliation. This was the paradox of Victorian morality. A society that praised purity and silence also demanded proof and evidence. Couples were expected to remain ignorant until marriage, yet to demonstrate knowledge the moment vows were spoken. Women were shielded from discussion of their own bodies, yet judged by the stains on their sheets. Men were told that passion was shameful, yet condemned if they lacked it on command. The contradictions were impossible to bear, and yet countless couples endured them. Consider again the marriage bed. The door is closed, the room still. But it is not empty. The weight of law presses in from one side, religion from another, family from a third, society from all around. Every glance, every touch, every silence is charged with expectation. The bed is not a sanctuary. It is a courtroom. The couple are not lovers. They are defendants. And the verdict, whether whispered in gossip, displayed in sheets, or declared in court, will shape the rest of their lives. This, perhaps, is the most inhuman aspect of all. Intimacy, stripped of tenderness, became performance. Love was not enough. Trust was not enough. What mattered was evidence, displayed or withheld, judged by others, carried in rumor, codified in law. The cruelty was not in what couples did or did not do, but in the way their most private selves were made public, forced into a trial from which there was no escape. And yet, even here, people endured. Couples found ways to live within this harsh system. Some grew close despite its intrusions, building trust slowly, finding tenderness in the cracks left by fear. Others lived in silence, carrying their burdens quietly, their hearts heavy but their faces composed. The resilience of the human spirit is not to be underestimated. But nor should we underestimate the cost. The Victorian marriage bed was, in many ways, the perfect symbol of its age. Outwardly refined, draped in elegance, steeped in ceremony. Inwardly fraught, marked by fear, shadowed by judgment. It was a stage where purity and proof were demanded, where silence was enforced, where the most intimate of acts became a matter of law and gossip. A courtroom, not a sanctuary. Silence has many shapes. It can be gentle, like the quiet of a candle-lit room when the world outside has gone to sleep. But it can also be heavy, oppressive, even suffocating. In Victorian marriage, silence was all of these at once. It was taught to children, expected of brides, demanded of husbands, and enforced by law, church, and custom. It was, in many ways, the defining sound of the wedding night. Not laughter, not conversation, not comfort, but silence. Young women were raised in silence. From childhood, they were told little about their own bodies. Modesty was prized above knowledge, purity above preparedness. Mothers sometimes hinted at the mysteries of marriage, But more often they said nothing at all, fearing that too much information would corrupt innocence. Daughters entered marriage ignorant, carrying fear in place of understanding. Diaries from the period speak of young brides who had not the faintest idea of what awaited them, who spent their wedding days shivering with dread. Silence, in their upbringing, had been presented as virtue. But on their wedding night, silence became terror. Husbands, too, bore the weight of silence, though of a different kind. Many men were taught that sexual matters should never be spoken of openly, not even with one's wife. Passion, when acknowledged, was treated as something coarse, unworthy of polite society. And so men, too, entered marriage burdened by ignorance or misinformation, their expectations shaped more by rumor than reality. When the wedding night came, many knew no better way forward than bluntness or force. Conversation was rare, tenderness rarer still. The silence between husband and wife was not accidental. It was the product of a culture that discouraged openness at every turn. In this silence, misunderstandings flourished. A bride who recoiled in fear might be taken as resistant, even defiant. A groom who hesitated might be seen as weak, even incapable. Neither could speak the truth of their feelings, for there was no space in which such words could be safely uttered. To speak of fear was to risk ridicule. To speak of pain was to invite suspicion. To speak of confusion was to mark oneself as ignorant in a world that punished ignorance. Silence was safer. Silence was expected. Silence was demanded. The cruelty of this silence is revealed most clearly in its consequences. Many women endured trauma in their first nights of marriage, yet spoke of it to no one. Not to their husbands, not to their mothers, not to their friends. They carried their pain quietly, their bodies marked, their spirits burdened. Some developed deep aversions to intimacy, retreating further into silence as the years went by. Others bore children, but never found comfort in the act that brought them. For them, marriage was not a partnership of equals but a lifelong endurance, each night another reminder of the silence imposed upon them. And the silence spread beyond the chamber. Families rarely asked brides about their experiences, and if they did, it was often in the form of veiled questions, seeking proof of purity rather than expressions of feeling. Doctors, when consulted, tended to dismiss women's accounts of pain or fear, attributing them to nerves or weakness. Husbands, even when they noticed their wives' distress, often had no language to address it. The culture had given them no words for tenderness, no vocabulary for comfort, no permission for honesty. Silence ruled, and silence punished. It is striking to note how often Victorian literature reflects this silence. Novels of the time are filled with marriages, but rarely with wedding nights. Authors, constrained by propriety, avoided direct mention of intimacy. Instead, they relied on euphemism and omission. A wedding would be described in lavish detail, the dress, the flowers, the guests, but the first night would vanish into ellipses or the turning of a page. Readers filled in the blanks with their own assumptions, perpetuating the cycle of silence. What was not written became what was not spoken, and what was not spoken became what was not understood. The silence was not always complete, of course. There were exceptions, brave women who whispered their fears to close friends, or who recorded them in hidden diaries. A few reformers even began to speak publicly about the need for education, for greater openness between husband and wife. But these voices were rare, and often met with resistance. To break the silence was to risk scandal. And scandal, in Victorian society, was a sentence nearly as severe as law. For men, too, silence could be destructive. A husband who struggled with impotence or anxiety had few places to turn. Doctors offered questionable remedies, ranging from tonics to bizarre mechanical devices. But few men dared to admit their struggles, even to physicians. To do so was to confess weakness in a world that equated manhood with dominance. Many simply endured in secret, their silence eating away at their confidence, their marriages strained by a problem neither partner could name. One might wonder why silence held such power. The answer lies in the Victorian obsession with appearances. A family's honor depended not on truth, but on how truth was perceived. If silence preserved the appearance of purity, of strength, of propriety, then silence was preferable to honesty. A bruised bride, a fearful groom, an unconsummated marriage, these truths could not be allowed to exist in public. And so silence became the foundation of the entire structure, the mortar that held together the fragile walls of reputation. The tragedy, of course, is that silence solved nothing. It did not ease pain. It did not erase fear. It did not heal wounds. It only buried them, leaving scars that endured for years, sometimes for lifetimes. Couples who might have found happiness together were instead divided by the gulf of unspoken words. Love that might have blossomed was stifled by the weight of silence. Lives that might have been free were bound in chains of secrecy. And yet, silence was not without its strange comforts. For some, it provided a shield. A woman could hide her pain behind a quiet smile. A man could conceal his anxieties behind a calm demeanor. Families could pretend all was well. Neighbors could avoid awkward truths. Silence smoothed over the rough edges of reality, making the unbearable appear bearable. But this comfort was hollow, purchased at the price of truth. To walk through a Victorian street at night, one might see rows of darkened windows, lamps flickering, shadows moving behind curtains. Each house contained its own story, its own silence. A young bride lying awake, too afraid to speak. A husband staring at the ceiling, uncertain of himself. Families downstairs, discussing inheritances, reputations, futures, all dependent on what was happening in the silence above. An entire society, held together not by trust or compassion, but by the absence of words. This, perhaps, is the most haunting legacy of the Victorian wedding night. Not only the fear, not only the humiliation, but the silence that wrapped around it all, binding it in place, passing it down through generations. Silence was the chain that held women in ignorance, men in fear, families in hypocrisy, and society in denial. It was the most invisible, and yet the most inescapable of all prisons. And so, when we think of the Victorian wedding night, let us remember not just the rituals, the courts, the sheets, the judgments. Let us remember the silence that filled the chambers, that shaped the marriages, that defined the lives of countless men and women. A silence so deep it could not be broken, a silence so heavy it still echoes today. The burden of proof is a phrase we associate today with law courts, with trials, with disputes argued before judges and juries. Yet in Victorian England, the phrase carried another, quieter meaning, one that entered the chambers of newlyweds and lingered long after the vows had been spoken. For in that age, proof was not confined to property disputes or criminal accusations. Proof was demanded of brides and grooms alike, and it was proof of the most intimate kind. On the wedding night, the couple was not simply expected to consummate their union, they were expected to demonstrate it. Families, communities, even the law, all required evidence that marriage had been fulfilled in body as well as in word. This burden of proof transformed the private into the public, the tender into the transactional, the sacred into the scrutinized. It turned love into evidence and intimacy into obligation. For brides, the burden was heaviest. A woman's worth was measured by her chastity, and chastity could only be proven in one way. The sight of blood upon the marriage sheets was regarded as confirmation that she had been pure until her wedding night. Without it, questions arose. Was she truly innocent? Had she been corrupted before marriage? Was the union valid? A young woman might be entirely virtuous, yet if her body did not produce the expected sign, she could find herself condemned by whispers and suspicion. The sheets themselves became objects of evidence. In some families, particularly among the upper classes, they were displayed the morning after the wedding, paraded before relatives or servants as proof of consummation. Imagine the indignity of such a ritual. The most private moment of one's life reduced to a public demonstration, a woman's body reduced to a stain. For the bride, there was no escape. If the sheets bore no mark, her silence was assumed to be guilt. If they did, her pain was treated not with compassion, but with triumph. The burden of proof was hers, and hers alone. Grooms, too, carried a burden, though of a different sort. Their masculinity was judged not by innocence, but by performance. A man who failed to consummate his marriage faced shame, ridicule, and even legal challenge. Rumors of impotence could destroy reputations, end careers, or bring annulments. A groom who hesitated out of compassion, who wished to comfort his fearful bride, risked being seen as weak. A groom who faltered physically risked being labeled incapable. For him, the burden of proof was not purity but potency, not innocence but virility. This system created an impossible paradox. The bride was expected to be ignorant, yet to prove her innocence. The groom was expected to be restrained, yet to prove his strength. Both were judged by outcomes they could not fully control, and all of it was measured not in love or trust, but in evidence demanded by others. The burden of proof pressed upon them both, heavier than any vows. The cruelty of this expectation extended far beyond the wedding night. If a couple failed to conceive within the first year, questions multiplied. Was the marriage truly consummated? Was the husband capable? Was the wife resisting her duties? Families pressed for answers. Doctors offered examinations and remedies. Priests urged duty and obedience. The couple's intimacy was pried open, dissected, judged. Their silence became suspicious. Their private lives became subject to inquiry. The burden of proof never lifted, it lingered, weighing down their days and nights. And in the courts, the burden was harsher still. Annulment cases required detailed evidence of what had, or had not, taken place in the marriage bed. Husbands and wives were forced to testify, to speak aloud the most private details of their lives before strangers. Doctors were summoned to examine bodies, to write reports, to stand as witnesses. Newspapers eagerly seized upon these scandals, printing lurid accounts for public consumption. What should have been private agony became public spectacle. The burden of proof was not only legal but social, not only intimate but humiliating. Consider the case of Arthur and Florence, a wealthy couple whose marriage in the 1870s ended in court. Florence claimed her husband had never consummated their union. Arthur insisted he had tried but failed. Doctors examined him, declared him incomplete, and the court granted annulment. The newspapers had a field day, mocking Arthur's inadequacy, speculating about Florence's ordeal. Their private sorrow became entertainment for thousands. This was the burden of proof, carried not only in the courtroom but in the laughter and gossip of society. For poorer couples, the courtroom was less accessible, but the burden was no less heavy. In villages and towns, proof was demanded in whispers rather than documents, in gossip rather than judgments. A bride who failed to show signs of purity faced ostracism. A groom who appeared hesitant became the subject of jokes. Even among those who had little to lose financially, the weight of reputation was crushing. For in a society where honor meant survival, a rumor could wound as deeply as a law. The burden of proof shaped the way couples approached their wedding nights. Many entered the chamber not with tenderness, but with fear of judgment. Husbands pressed forward out of anxiety, wives submitted out of duty, both driven not by desire, but by the knowledge that evidence must be produced. The sheets would be inspected, the rumors would spread, the law might intervene. The night was not theirs alone, it belonged to everyone who demanded proof. And yet, in all of this, the humanity of the couple was often lost. Their hopes, their fears, their tenderness, their confusion, all were erased beneath the weight of expectation. They were reduced to evidence, their love to a contract, their bodies to exhibits. The burden of proof stripped away the possibility of true intimacy, leaving only performance and judgment. Let us pause to imagine it. A young bride sits on the edge of her bed, her heart racing. She knows that her body will be judged by others, that her silence will be interpreted, that her worth hangs upon a sign she cannot control. A groom stands beside her, equally anxious, knowing that his masculinity will be measured not in kindness but in performance, that failure will mark him for life. Between them lies the bed, no longer a place of rest, but a stage upon which they must perform, a courtroom in which they are both defendants. The candle burns low, the shadows stretch long, and the burden of proof hangs over them, heavy as stone. This was the cruel paradox of the Victorian wedding night. What should have been a moment of union became instead a trial. What should have been private became public. What should have been tender became transactional. The burden of proof was not only inhuman, it was unbearable. And yet, couples endured it. Some found ways to carry the burden together, to laugh quietly in defiance, to shield one another from the worst of the world's judgment. Others were crushed beneath it, their marriages strained, their spirits broken. The burden shaped lives, scarred hearts, and echoed across generations. It was the invisible weight carried into every chamber, the unspoken verdict hanging over every bed. This, then, is the legacy of the Victorian wedding night, a legacy not of romance but of evidence, not of intimacy but of proof. A legacy that turned love into a trial and silence into a sentence. The burden of proof was inescapable, and it defined not only the night of the wedding, but the very fabric of Victorian marriage itself. The wedding night did not end when the candles burned low and the chamber fell quiet. For most Victorian couples, the real weight of it began in the morning. The first light of dawn often revealed not comfort, not relief, but the lingering consequences of a night that had been shaped more by fear, duty, and expectation than by tenderness. This aftermath, silent, heavy, and lasting, was as much a part of the inhuman practices of Victorian marriage as the night itself. For the bride, morning brought scrutiny. She might wake sore, bewildered, or ashamed, but before she had even gathered her thoughts, the world intruded. Servants might come with trays of breakfast, their eyes darting to the bed, to the sheets. In some homes, those sheets were removed for inspection, carried out like exhibits from a trial. A maid might whisper of what she saw, and before long, the household would know whether the marriage had been properly begun. In grander estates, relatives might even expect proof displayed. The humiliation of this ritual cannot be overstated. What should have remained private was torn open, her body reduced to evidence, her innocence judged by stains upon cloth. But even where sheets were not displayed, the pressure was palpable. The absence of proof could be as damning as its presence was humiliating. Neighbors, relatives, even strangers felt entitled to speculate. A bride who walked stiffly the next day was judged with knowing smiles. A bride who seemed composed was questioned in whispers. There was no way to emerge unscathed, for every sign, pain or poise, silence or chatter, could be read as proof of something. In this way, the morning after became a theater, the bride the unwilling actress, her performance judged by an audience she had never invited. The groom, too, awoke to expectation. His reputation as a man, as a husband, as a future father, depended on what had occurred, or what was believed to have occurred, during the night. If he carried himself with pride, others assumed success. If he seemed withdrawn or anxious, rumors began at once. His virility was not private, it was a matter of public interest. In taverns, in drawing rooms, in whispers between servants, men's reputations were dissected mercilessly. A failed consummation, or even a delayed one, could shadow him for life. Thus the morning after was not a moment of relief but of judgment, the weight of expectation pressing as heavily as it had the night before. For many couples, the aftermath extended far beyond the first morning. In the weeks that followed, the question of children began to loom. Victorian society expected pregnancy quickly, and its absence raised suspicions. Was the marriage consummated at all? Was the bride barren, or the groom impotent? Families speculated, physicians were consulted, gossip thickened. The intimacy of the couple was dissected without mercy, their silence treated as evidence, their privacy dismissed as irrelevant. What had begun as a single night of scrutiny became a lifelong trial. The emotional aftermath was equally profound. A bride who entered her marriage in fear, endured pain in silence, and woke to humiliation could hardly be expected to view intimacy with joy. For many women, the wedding night was not the beginning of tenderness but the beginning of endurance. They carried the trauma with them, night after night, year after year, fulfilling a duty rather than sharing an affection. Some grew distant, retreating into silence. Others hardened themselves, learning to separate body from spirit. In every case, the scars of that first night shaped the marriage that followed. Husbands, too, bore scars. A man who faltered under the weight of expectation, or who sensed his bride's fear in silence, might carry guilt or shame for years. Others, hardened by the culture of proof, pressed forward with duty, never pausing to question the cruelty of the system that demanded performance above compassion. Even those who longed for tenderness often found it difficult to bridge the silence imposed upon them. The aftermath of the wedding night was not easily healed, for it had been built upon foundations of fear, ignorance, and judgment. The burden extended beyond individuals to entire families. Inheritance, reputation, and alliances all depended on the legitimacy of marriage. A union that failed to produce heirs threatened the survival of estates. A bride whose purity was questioned damaged not only herself but her kin. A groom mocked for weakness tarnished his lineage. Families watched the couple's lives with keen interest, their futures tied to what took place in the private chamber. Thus the aftermath was not confined to husband and wife, it rippled outward, shaping the fortunes of many. The cruelty of this system lies in its persistence. A single night, fraught with fear and silence, echoed for decades. It shaped relationships, dictated reputations, and determined futures. It robbed couples of privacy, of tenderness, of the chance to begin their lives together in trust. And it did so under the guise of morality, propriety, and virtue. The wedding night was framed as sacred, yet it was made into spectacle. It was spoken of as pure, yet it was burdened with humiliation. Its aftermath was not joy but judgment, not intimacy but intrusion. Imagine, if you will, a Victorian bride walking through her new home the morning after her wedding. She smiles faintly, though her body aches. She passes servants who glance at her, relatives who murmur, neighbors who speculate. Every step is watched, every gesture interpreted. She feels the weight of eyes upon her, though no one speaks directly. In the quiet of her chamber, she weeps softly, knowing her life has changed forever. Not only because she is married, but because her body, her silence, her very self, has become evidence for others to judge. Now imagine the groom, standing in his study, staring out the window. He knows his reputation hangs upon whispers he cannot control. He feels pride, perhaps, or shame, or fear, but above all, he feels the weight of expectation. His manhood has been measured not by kindness, not by loyalty, but by performance. He is judged not as a husband, but as a figure in a trial he never chose. The silence of his house feels heavy, the voices of others pressing in. He too has been changed, not by intimacy, but by judgment. This, then, is the true aftermath of the Victorian wedding night, lives shaped by fear, silence, and scrutiny. Marriages that might have been tender became trials. Families that might have rejoiced became inquisitors. A night that should have been sacred became evidence in a courtroom that never closed. The aftermath was long, unyielding, and inescapable.